Ron Klain is the White House Chief of Staff, and he joins me to talk more about what we may hear from the president tonight. Mr. Klain, this is the State of the Union speech, but how much of the president's remarks will focus on Ukraine tonight, and what does he want the American people to know about the conflict?
Well, he will begin by talking about the conflict in Ukraine, the Russian invasion, and he'll talk about what we've done so far to combat that aggression. He'll talk about the coalition he pulled together, this kind of unprecedentedly strong coalition of our NATO allies and other countries who are providing aid to Ukraine, providing aid to the army, providing aid to the Ukrainians that are heroically fighting the Russians, as well as the coalition we've pulled together to impose unprecedented sanctions on Russia and its economy. So the American people are going to hear what we're doing, what we're going to do to help the Ukrainian people in this struggle and to make sure that Russian aggression pays a serious price.
And depending what happens in Kyiv tonight, could we be looking at a split-screen moment? Is there concern Vladimir Putin might want to upstage the president?
Look, the concern is that 6 days ago, Vladimir Putin launched an unjustified, unprecedented assault on Ukraine. The concern is that he continues to target civilians in Ukraine. I care less about what hour of the day or night this happens and more about the fact that what Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine is wrong, and that's why the United States has assembled this amazing coalition led by President Biden, joined by leaders from around the globe to devastate the Russian economy as a result. We're down to now it takes more than 100 rubles to buy a single U.S. dollar. Their stock market's been unable to open this week. Russian inflation's over 20%. So they are paying a price for what they're doing, whatever hour of the day and night they do it.
All right. Ron Klain, good to have you on today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Lester.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.